Welcome back to our study on the book of Romans. This is the Sonship Review Part 9, and this is Session 2. Now, right there between sessions, we had a question came up that said, if you're saved, you're not going to go through that judgment for... In other words, you won't even stand in line for the judgment that determines, are you saved or not? The only folks that stand in that line are the folks that are not justified. There is no judgment of that sort for us. I mean, we do have the judge seat of Christ, which will determine where we're going to be placed in the creature and our rewards, but that's a whole different kind of judgment. So I just wanted to mention that. I should have said at the end of that session, are there any questions? And that was a good one. Are there any other questions anybody has about justification? The highlights for that. Okay, so we're on to number 2. Sanctification essentials. Sanctification means that something has been set apart unto God for the purpose for which it was created. And as our justification had 3 parts to it, your sanctification has 3 parts to it. Number 1, we're dead to sin, which means we are not. Doesn't mean sin is dead. It means we're no longer servants to sin. Number 2, we are alive unto God. And number 3, we are sons of God by way of adoption. There's the 3 component parts. You should know those. Those are important. In sanctification, we're given some positional truths that are supposed to function in our everyday life. They're abstract. In other words, they're spiritual things. But we've got to put them to work in the reality of our everyday life. So, in sanctification, we just have another aspect of God's grace at work in us. All right, now look, a couple things to talk about here. There's a couple things I want to talk about. It's not in your notes. I just want to mention it to kind of set some things up. But when God sanctified us, He did it while these bodies are still unredeemed. It has to be that way. Why? Because if your body is redeemed, there is no work of grace that is going to be happening in you. And God has decided that this work of grace in us, is not going to happen magically. He's not waving a wand and suddenly we're all, like that. But this is going to happen by His Word. In other words, we're going to read the Word, we understand the Word, we believe the Word, and then that changes our thinking, and then that influences our conduct. That's the work of grace in us. And that's the way He has designed for all of this to take place. So, and that necessitates that the nature of sin is still working in us. It means we have a decision to make. Every time those things come up, we have a decision to make. So it was not an oversight that He did not redeem our bodies. He will one day, but not yet. Those doctrines that we're learning are sufficient to overcome every challenge that we're going to face in our life. That is the all-sufficiency of grace. And I said it this way in your notes, you will have the reality of grace reigning supreme in your mortal body. That is a big deal. That's a big deal. Okay. And just as I said to you earlier, everything God is doing today is working to conform us to the image of His Son. Everything He has chosen not to do today is because He is working to conform us to the image of God's Son. Now listen to me carefully. I just want to make sure we all got this down. It is not about the fact that God doesn't have the power. Of course He has the power. When someone says, boy, we could really use some rain, and pray for rain. I mean, I see that on those billboards of churches going down the interstate to Glenrose in the hot summer. Pray for rain. Here's the thing. We talked about this. God is not intervening in the outward circumstances. Why? Because those things do not conform us to the image of God's Son. Now I'm using the rain thing because that one's kind of benign. You know, we don't get all offended over that one too much because we live out here and we know rain doesn't really exist. If God made it rain, that won't edify you. Why? Because there is nothing in His Word written to you about that you are believing and understanding and then implementing into your everyday conduct. You're just asking Him to do something that you have absolutely nothing to do with. You don't have to integrate that into your thinking. You don't have to integrate that into your conduct and behavior, and you can't labor with Him in it. There is no godliness aspect to that. So what is God interested in? Conforming us to the image of His Son. So everything He's doing has that in mind. And the things that don't do that, He's not doing those. Which is why in the dispensation of grace, He's focused on the inner man, not the outer man. Now you say, but that would make it look like God doesn't care. But you understand that no matter what we're going through, that grace is sufficient to do something in us so that we do what to those circumstances? We do what? Looking for two words. First one's an adverb because it ends with ly. Patiently endure to His glory. In other words, isn't there doctrine there that is meant to cause us to have peace in our heart in the midst of a very adverse circumstance? Isn't there doctrine sitting there that is supposed to build endurance in us so that instead of getting wore down by the trial, we actually at the end become more than conquerors? Isn't that what the Scripture is talking about? So it's not that He doesn't care. You know, Lord, I don't, you know what? I was going to name a disease and now I can't think of the right one. I put my hand back here and I thought, what's back there? You know what? My arthritis is flaring up. Okay, look, there's doctrine that allows you to be able to patiently endure that. We're going to get to it. One of those is the idea that you won't be like that forever. He's going to give you and He's going to redeem this body one day. But in the meantime, we're putting something on display in the midst of all those things that are happening to us. Okay, so it's not about He doesn't have the power to do it. It's about, is that going to conform us to the image of His Son or not? This is about putting the power of His grace on display, not His omnipotent power. Okay, so what happens when someone says this miraculous, supernatural, wonderful thing happened? I didn't put it on the PowerPoint. I probably should have. So let me just run through it. I have about 5 of them for you. First of all, it could be that Satan has produced a counterfeit. Can you think of anywhere in the Bible where Satan counterfeited what God was doing in order to deceive people? Well, sure. And what's the whole purpose of that? To corrupt the truth. Okay, here's the second one. What happened as a progression of events naturally. Cause and effect. Okay, look. I know we've been through this, so I don't want to get caught up on it. People get the flu. I don't know how long it takes to get over the flu. Let's say 10 days. So they take antibiotics and they take a bunch of stuff, and in about 10 days they're feeling better. And then you have folks that take antibiotics and take stuff and pray for God to heal them. And in about 10 days they feel better. And then you have folks that don't take anything and they just pray. and somewhere between 10 days to 14 days they feel better, or they get worse, and then they go take something. I'm just saying, it is, okay, let me just be plain about it. It is of interest to me that people want to talk about God is in the healing business, yet they are wearing glasses just like I do to read, yet when they have an accident, and I can tell you of specifics, where there was a great fall and their ankles were broken, guess how long it took them to recover? The same length of time that folks take who don't even believe in God. It didn't work any differently. What we do is we take natural occurrences, though, and we want to read the supernatural into them. Don't do that. This is one of those hang-ups that's going to become a blockade eventually to your sonship life. Someone says, you ever go to the fair and they have all these bottles, and there's hundreds of them out there, and they give you these little rings, and the ring is just barely able to go over the neck of the bottle. I can remember getting a bunch of those rings, and I threw it up there, and about the second or third ring, it plopped right down on a bottle. I get this big panther, the Pink Panther thing, okay? I get this big Pink Panther. So I got 20 rings to throw. I got another 17 rings. I'm thinking, man, I may make a haul here. Boing, 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 boing. They're bouncing everywhere. Do you know, what was it that allowed... See, am I supposed to look at that and go, well, God made that go? God doesn't give two flips about me winning a Pink Panther. That doesn't edify him. It doesn't conform me to the image of his Son. It is just the statistical anomaly of it. Sometimes that is what happens. It's just the cause and effect. Here's the third one. Men manipulate a situation in order to get a desired outcome. There are those who carried on healing ministries in this country who have people who are going to come down the aisle and they're going to be healed from whatever malady because they're trying to encourage other people to come down the aisle. But those are manipulated. That is a fact. Those people have come forward and said that. Number 4. The details of the event are misunderstood. When Jesus cast out devils, do you remember what they said he was doing it? By the power of Beelzebub. Was he? Well, how do we know that? See, they didn't understand the event. They just didn't understand what was happening. And because they didn't have an understanding, they misidentified what was happening. And here's the last one. Someone lied about what happened. And that happens all the time. I'm sorry. I'm just being frank with you about it. When I was up in Granbury pastoring Glen River Chapel, there was a church up there that had a big revival meeting, and people were being told about all the things that are going to be happening to them in the future, and God was doing all these miracle things. And you know what they said? They came out of there saying, God, at the beginning of the meeting, God was turning people's fillings into solid gold. By the end of the meeting, which went on for a couple of months, God was giving people gold fillings who didn't even have fillings. Those were both a lie. No one ever produced that evidence. That was a lie. Sometimes people lie because they're really trying to make a point about how great God is. They're not trying to be nefarious about it. They don't think of it that way. God doesn't need us to stretch the truth in order to show people how great He is. So I'm telling you this. There's somebody on the tape. I know they're watching the recording and they're going, yeah, well, what about this? I don't know what to tell you except Do not allow this kind of thinking to be successful with you. It will ultimately harm your sonship life. It will. Okay, that being said, Romans chapter 6. Here's what we learn from the first 13 verses of Romans chapter 6. Number one, that we are dead to sin. Sin is not dead, but our relationship with sin is dead. Number two, we have been raised to walk in newness of life. Number three, our old man is crucified with Christ. Number four, that we are free from sin and we are no longer its servant. And that we are to reckon ourselves dead to sin and alive unto God. And I think that is the last of that list. Now, let me give you this one. The doctrine concerning our sanctification teaches us to overcome sin by means of our new identity in Christ. That's how you overcome sin. Do you know how most people overcome sin? Okay, they try to do it on their own. There's a single word that says just what Linda said. Willpower. It's just willpower. And do you know how long that lasts? About 3 weeks. Some people have a little more will than others. When most people read that they are dead to sin, it does not occur to them what is really happening. And do you know why? Because they still have trouble with sin. Sin doesn't seem dead to them. They're still plagued by it. So, that's why it's necessary to understand the doctrine, not understand how you feel about the temptations of sin. So here are the 5 steps that produce an assurance that we are dead to sin. Number 1, by baptism, I am identified with all that the Redeemer did. I'm just pulling these out of the verses. That's Romans 6:3. I am planted in the likeness of His death in verse 4. My old man is crucified in verse 6. The body of sin has been destroyed. That's in verse 6. And I am free from sin's mastership. In other words, everything that needed to have been done to free us from sin has been done. Now, you may not look at those and go, boy, I understand exactly what God did in order to do that, but He says that He did it. That's the part that you need to have in your thinking. So, how do we make that a reality, that I am dead to sin? Verse 11. Likewise, reckon ye also yourselves to be dead indeed unto sin. So, how do we reckon something? Well, reckoning does believe counting it to be true, but it also has another element to it. Reckoning means counting it to be true even when there seems to be evidence to the contrary. Now that's in your notes, and you can look at that, and you can go back to your original notes, and we did a lot of work on that. But it's not just acknowledging that something is true, but it means putting that into active operation regardless of the circumstances. Acknowledgement doesn't mean you're doing anything. Reckoning does. Reckoning meant you are doing something with that. So, we have 2 appeals that are being made to us. One appeal is the lust of sin in our members that we now have the power to say no to. And the other appeal is from God in our sanctified life that we can now give ourselves over to and produce fruit unto holiness. So, once again, because of who you are in Christ, yielding to sin is inconsistent with who you've been made to be. Romans 6:13. Neither yield ye your members as instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. That phrase, as those that are alive from the dead, that is what is meant to make you think about this the way that you are supposed to. You were dead functionally. And now, when you trusted Jesus Christ, those that are alive from the dead. Now, you're not in that position anymore. Look, I know I'm walking you through this. So here's the idea. Here's the next idea. You cannot live in accordance with who you have been made to be in Jesus Christ by living under the law. That is an important thing to get in your mind. I think everybody here gets that. I've never heard anybody say anything here that indicates to me that you don't already have this. But it is important, and so I'm saying that for everyone that's watching the recording. Your sanctification cannot, will not ever work under the law. And policy of evil is counting on folks not understanding this doctrine so that they will live their lives, their Christian lives, in the energy of their flesh. So here's what we learn in Romans 6:14-23. Sin will not have dominion over us. We learn that we're not under the law but under grace. And by the way, the reason sin won't have dominion over us is because we're under grace. The law is what empowers sin. God removed sin's dominion by taking us out from under the law. That we can produce fruit unto holiness by grace alone. And we also learn that the law is incapable of restraining sin and promoting good. Does everybody understand those? Under the law, sin has dominion. Look, if you're under the law, can you keep that law? You can't. You cannot perfectly keep that law. Sin is going to have dominion over you. So God says, you're not under the law, you're under grace. And He has to do that in order to break sin's dominion. We can produce fruit unto holiness by grace alone. Do you remember the question that someone asked when we were going through this the first time way back years ago? When we got to this point and someone said, but if you don't have a law, what keeps you from doing the wrong thing? What is the answer to that? Grace. The law has no power to keep you from doing wrong. Does it? In fact, Paul talks about that. It doesn't have any power to keep you from doing wrong. Only grace has the power to keep you from doing wrong. So what is it that keeps us from doing wrong? It's not the law, it's grace. You know why that question comes up? Because our whole Christian life, we've never been taught to about how to live out of grace. We've only been given a list of rules to follow. That's the only way we ever understood how to do it. Now this is going to do it in a different way. Okay, so that's why he says, for sin shall not have dominion over you, for you're not under the law, but under grace. See how they're connected. Now, let's go to Romans chapter 7. In Romans 7, 1 through 3, we learn that we're no longer bound by the law, though we yet live. What does that mean? Well, I brought that out of the verse. It means you didn't have to physically die in order to get set free from the law. There is something about you that died. That old man, remember that old man was crucified with Him. There is something about you that died, but thankfully you didn't have to physically die. I mean, can you see now? It's Kim's birthday coming up, so I'll use Kim. So Kim says, why is she shaking her head like this is going to be a bad thing? This is a good thing. Kim says, you know what? I want to be free from sin. I want to be free from the law. So we go, you know what we got to do? We got to put her to death. But don't worry, we're going to do our best to revive you after that. And if you come back, guess what? You'll be free. So I just wonder how many of us would want to do that. Okay, Barbara's saying no. See, thank God He knows how to get that done. All right, so let's keep moving through this here. Romans 7:1, I just want you to see this. Know ye not, brethren, for I speak to them that know the law, how that the law hath dominion over a man as long as he liveth. That's what everybody thought. As long as a man is alive, the law has dominion over him. But you know what? God knew that there was a way to break that dominion. Now, let me kind of catch up with where we are in our notes. Okay? We learned in Romans 7 that the law exposed our inability to produce our own sanctification. Can you save yourself? You can't sanctify yourself. That is ridiculous. We learned in Romans 7 that the law gave sin the power. By the way, that says 1 through 6. We're actually going to go beyond 1 through 6, just saying. The law gave sin the power to exceed all of our honest efforts. That is true. The law puts our functional life to death. That is true. That we have always been incapable of producing our own sanctification. That is true. We learned that to live unto God under the law is to live in the flesh. See, that's not how God designed that to happen. We learned that Paul tried to live unto God by the law and he utterly failed. That was that wretched man concept that he was talking about over there. We learned that the law can never be utilized to do any of this, to walk in newness of life, or to live unto God, or to put our sanctification into effect, or to restrain sin, or to promote righteousness, or to please God. I mean, there's just a bunch of ways there to say the same exact thing. You can't do any of that under the law. Which is why we learned back in Romans 6 that we're not under the law, but we're under the grace. So, the law may tell you what not to do, but you need to know what to do. And living out of grace. Okay, now look, there's something else I want to talk to you as an aside here. Let me just think about how to say this, because I just need to say something that's not in your notes. When we decide that we're the ones that are going to produce... No, I'm not saying that right. I was going to say, when we decide we're going to produce our own sanctification, how would you do that? How would a guy go about producing his own sanctification? By just doing a bunch of good stuff, right? He'd just look at a bunch of good stuff. I'm going to spend 3 hours every day in prayer, and I'm going to witness to 5 people today, and I'm going to read my Bible for 2 hours, and I'm going to go and do something good for someone who is in need, and I'm going to go up and spray all those weeds out in the church parking lot, and I noticed those today. Those are like, okay. Anyway. He's got all this lined up, and he thinks, but the only way to live in a way that is any of this, the way to walk in newness of life, the way to live unto God, the way to put your sanctification into effect, is to live out of your new identity that He gave you, not out of what you can produce. It's out of what He produced and gave to you as a free gift of grace. Does everybody understand that? That's an important concept to what we're talking about here. If you do it any other way than living out of, what are those things? I mean, we gave them on the list here. That you are dead to sin. I don't have to say yes to sin anymore. That old master-slave relationship got broken. My old man got crucified. And I was raised to walk in newness of life. Therefore, I am alive unto God. Before you weren't dead to sin, what? You were under sin's mastership. You weren't alive unto God. You were dead to God. There wasn't anything you could do to please Him. That's the first two, saving the third one for this next section. Living out of this is how you overcome sin and produce a righteousness that God is well pleased with. It's out of who He has made you to be. What you do may look like the same thing this other guy does, but it's coming from a whole different motivation. Yours is coming from who you have been made to be in Jesus Christ. His is just coming out of Him deciding to do a bunch of good stuff in order to be sanctified. if it's not coming out of what, because, why? Why? I'm saying all this. Why isn't that good enough? Why can't the guy pray 2 hours a day and read his Bible 3 hours a day and witness to 5 people and go do a bunch of good stuff and produce his own sanctification?
Because he's trying to take the glory for it.
Because it's self-righteousness. Clifford says because he's trying to get the glory for that.
What about a monk? Gives everything away that was in the monastery.
And what is he doing?
Praying.
Yeah, I'm saying though, he gives everything away and he goes, he just sits in a monastery and he prays all day. Is God looking at that and saying, yeah, that's the life I want everybody to do right there? Is that it? No, that's not it. Why? Because that's what he has decided to do in order to be holy. See? And don't we call them that? Oh, that's a holy man. You know, that's what we say. But that's not how holiness gets produced. Because that's not out of what was given to him as a part of his, this issue of sanctification. He's not living out of that. He's just determining a bunch of good stuff to go do. And that's self-righteousness. How does God feel about self-righteousness? He abhors it. He hates it. Why? Just think with me for a minute. Why is God against self-righteousness so much? Who in your Bible is a notable group that was guilty of self-righteousness? The Pharisees. It wasn't that they... Look, you remember those guys, they did everything. They crossed every T, they dotted I. I even tithed from the mint in my garden. The whole issue with them wasn't that they were doing those things. It was that they were producing those good works. They weren't producing any of that out of what God had done, but hadn't done anything for them. They couldn't have any good works. Why? Because they weren't even justified. They hadn't even had step 1 of being spiritually fit, let alone step 2. God hates all that because it's self-righteousness. Isn't that that's the same thing a lost man does? Okay, I'm going to ask you the question again. Why does God hate self-righteousness so much? Because that is a man thinking he can be righteous without God. That's why it's self-righteous. I don't need God. I can do it. When you get to... Do you understand how this is a step in a wrong direction? This is the step on the Christian end that helps the whole world get to a godless condition. We don't need God. Now look, you can say that in a lot of ways. I mean, there's things that go on in the country, you can look around and say, well, they're trying to get rid of God. That may be true. But do you know the most fundamental way? We have already gotten rid of Him. Because we don't understand that it is only by living out of that new identity that we are ever going to produce a righteousness that He is pleased with. And that's it. If we don't get that one right, the rest of that is just other stuff. Can I just... Look, I know we got to take a break. But look. Well, they took prayer out of school, and then they want to take In God We Trust off the money, and then they want... You really think anybody reads that on the money anymore? Let's suppose they put prayer back in school. How do you think they're praying? My question would be, if they put prayer back in the Monahan school, who would lead it? How much do they really understand about what to pray for? See, those are side issues. And they're a result of abandoning the fundamental issues. That's the point that I'm trying to make about this. So, someone can have a sincere desire to do good. They can have a sincere desire that I don't want to sin anymore. But look, if they're not accomplished, I'm just not saying this right. It's not in the notes, so I'm just kind of struggling with it. It is not so much about what it is that you're doing, but what is motivating what you're doing. If it's out of what God provided and gave you, that's one thing. If it's just out of what you generate, then that is another. Even though both of those acts may look the same from the outside. And so let me finish this up and get us to this last session. Overview of Romans 8, 1 through 13. A believer in Christ is not automatically in the Spirit. Not all believers are in the Spirit. You only become in the Spirit when the Spirit of God dwells in you. The dwelling of the Spirit of God is not automatic and it is not permanent. Everybody understand this? Are you remembering this? You're not? Or you are? Once you begin minding the things of the Spirit, that's when the Spirit of God dwells in you. Do you remember those? Romans 8, 14 and 15. That's the final command. It's too late. This is where this session ends, right here. Anybody looking at that stuff that's on the board right now, and you look at that and you go like, that doesn't ring a bell with me. You are given the Spirit the moment you trusted Jesus Christ. You have Him. But you having the Spirit and Him dwelling in you are two different things. Let's suppose someone comes to visit Mark and Sarita. When they come in and let's say they're going to stay for a couple of weeks. So they come in, and one day Sarita comes in, and you know what she finds out? Her dining table has been moved, and some other things have been shuffled around, and all of a sudden she's looking for stuff, and she's going, what's going on? And somebody says, well, I didn't, this really wasn't working for me, so I did this. Well, would that be uncommon? That be weird? Sure it would. You know why? Now, because that's her home, right? And when she does in her home, is she arranges her home the way she likes it. Doesn't everybody do that? That's what the Spirit does. When He is so at home that He now can begin to arrange I'm going to call it the furniture, but your inner man. He begins to arrange that the way He wants it. Do you know what that is? He's arranging that when it lines up. When you begin to live in line with the doctrine, that is what makes Him comfortable. Now He feels at home. The kind of artwork that Sarita puts on the walls, see, well, that's like the Spirit. He's looking at, how do I want to garnish your inner man? How do I want to decorate this inner man? How do and so just because you have Him doesn't mean He feels at home there. Because like a guest that normally would come in for 2 weeks, they're not coming in to redo Sarita's home. They're just there. You see, that's in the sense the Bible's using it, they're not dwelling there in the Bible sense of that word. They may be there. So, yes, you get the Spirit, but not all believers are, when I say in the Spirit, you know what, maybe a better way to have said that are, they're not all, I pulled that out of the Scripture, but you could say, they're not walking after the Spirit. That'd be another way to say that. The dwelling of the Spirit is not automatic. He doesn't automatically begin to do that just because you get saved. And it's not permanent, because guess what? What if someone decides, I'm not living this way anymore? Does the Spirit now still feel at home there and able to do all the things He wants to do? No. Do they still have Him? Yes, they still have Him. But He's not in control anymore. He's not the one doing that. And once you begin minding the things of the Spirit, that's when the Spirit of God dwells in you. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. All right, we'll stop and take a break. And then we'll do the last one.